Well, welcome alongside. There's a lot of people frowning today. I'm not entirely sure why everyone's so grumpy. The cricket's going very well for England, so I'm not entirely sure what else would you care about in the world. The rain seems to agree with all of you, though. So, well, welcome along. I'm going to be talking to you today about application security and microservices. To an extent, what I've done here is I've put the word microservices out like bait on a hook to bring you in to talk actually about application security. We are going to talk about both things, don't worry. But you will learn things, I hope. Coming out of this talk, my name's Sam Newman. I wrote the book. You can go and buy the book downstairs if you want. You don't have to buy the book. I don't mind too much. It's fine. Please buy the book, though, because I haven't got a job at the moment, so it'd be great. Anyway, I'm currently working with a startup called Atomist. We do stuff in the microservices space. If you're interested in what we do, go ask me later or look at the .com. But we should start off at the beginning with another plea to buy my book. No, not another plea to buy my book. To talk, actually, I want to get a sense of the audience here. This is only my second time in Antwerp. Last time, I came here for the conference last year, and I was here for all of about 16 hours. So I didn't really get to know any of you or get to know the kind of crowd that comes to DevOps Antwerp. So I wanted to ask right at the beginning, do we have any doctors in the house? I mean, I can't quite see. I'm shielding my lights. Are any of you a doctor? Some sort of... So any doctors? There's a couple of hands up, right? There's a couple of hands up. That's good. Right, I mean, that's not the wrong. That's the wrong kind of doctor, isn't it? This kind of doctor, medical doctor. Hands up for any medical doctors in the room. Are there any of you out there? Are there any immunologists, virologists in the room? People who have done research on bacteria? Any of those sorts of people? Anybody who's played Pandemic? I'm lowering the bar now. There we go. Yes, I thought there'd be a few people that have played Pandemic. Well, if anyone gets sick, of course, these are the people to talk to. The reason I sort of start off by asking this question is because we have a very, very small representation of medical practitioners in the room. It might be zero, but I'm hoping, and at least judging on my experiences thus far in the bathroom, that most of you know the importance of washing your hands after you've been to the toilet. Hands up if you don't know how important it is to wash your hands after you've been. All I'm going to say is if anyone does put their hands up, stay well away from those hands. This is the thing. We do not necessarily have to have multiple years of study and expertise to understand the importance of doing some basic hygiene to keep us well and to keep our families well. But when it comes to application security, we're kind of in the place where we still assume somebody else is going to solve the problem for us. We're sort of where we were with testing, say, 15 years ago, when you'd go and talk to organizations and say, wouldn't it be great if you maybe, when you wrote some code, actually made sure the code worked? This is brain-blowing stuff at the time. And I go, oh, no, we have other people for that. They make sure the code, because the code works in my head, and then they make sure it works in the real world. And that's just how things are. And we've realized that maybe doing something around making sure our code actually working, actually investing some time and energy in something like automated tests might be a good idea. More recently, we're starting to come to believe that also perhaps just sprinkling in usability at the end of the process, like sort of glitter. We'll just sort of glitter, sprinkle on some glitter or have usability or applications. Maybe actually that doesn't work either, and we should bring some design thinking into how we build our products. But when it comes to security, it's too hard. We don't even know the basics. We don't need to be experts, but there's certainly a subset of application security that all developers, I think, should have, in the same way that we don't expect every developer to be an expert in the field of automated testing, but we do now expect you to write a few tests. So hopefully today I'm going to share with you some hand-washing type stuff. This is a talk about security, and normally I feel the need to scare you. It seems that current events may have scared you anyway, but I'll give it a good old try. How many people here have seen this site before? This is Norse Corp. Right, so this is the top tip that's going to come out of the conference. You're going to want to go back to your employers, and they're going to ask you, how great was the conference? And of course, you need to explain how awesome it was and show that you've learnt loads of new stuff. Because you want to come back again next year, right? So you need to justify the investment. Best way you can do that, so I've been learning about security, pop up a spare monitor and just have this running in the background. And they say, what are you doing? You say, I'm monitoring our perimeter. Because all it is, it's like an online sort of video of near real-time attacks that are going on in the internet. So this is sort of just showing you the general background noise and radiation almost that we live in. There's sort of interesting information you can see up here. You can see sort of the attack targets. You can also see the attack types. And you'll see lots of old protocols. And while that was when my machine went very slow, it turned out somebody was very cross with somebody in South America at the moment. And they were cross with somebody in the Middle East. And that's so weird because it's such a calm, placid place normally. And Australia is asleep, and no one really cares about us anyway. I live in Australia. So this is sort of the backdrop of the world we live in. A lot of these attacks are targeted. A lot of them aren't. You'll often there's this background noise. There are bots that are just looking for people running old versions of WordPress. It's not a malicious intent directly against you. These aren't necessarily attackers that are targeting your site, but there are just things that will try and do stuff to your system, just for lols. And of course, there are people that might want to do more serious things to you. If you are running some kind of public-facing technology company, and you are non-trivial in size, the question is not, if you're going to face some kind of attack and maybe suffer some sort of breach. The question is more when. And the reality is a lot of our time and attention is sort of focused on stopping bad things from happening. I'm also going to talk to you today about the things you need to do to make sure that if something bad does happen, you can deal with it. This is just the backdrop. This is just every day now. So we have to build our systems in a more resilient way and actually build them with defense in depth. This is a talk about microservices, so I have to talk about microservices a lot, and I will do. It's kind of my jam. My definition of microservices is sort of, it varies, but I tend to draw them as hexagons. Hexagons are a nice shape. They tessellate. There's a pleasant feel to them. I dislike layers. That's why I don't do rectangles, because rectangles, people layer them up. I talk in my book about onion architecture, architecture with loads of layers, and when you cut through them, it makes you cry. These are tessellate, and they are sort of oriented around business concepts because we found that those boundaries are more stable. So the rough definition I use, and I use variations on it every now and then, small autonomous services that work together, modeled around a business domain. When I mean autonomous, what I'm primarily talking about is independent deployability. And if there's only one thing you learn about microservices this year, it's that really you need to optimize for independent deployability of services. That's going to get you most of the benefits that people strive for when they adopt microservice architectures. Now, obviously, this sort of decomposed, albeit connected relationship gives us some interesting questions around security. Now, straight away, when I first started looking at these sorts of architectures, I started seeing some potential positives in the realm of application security. With a monolithic system, I've typically got a small number of processes. I've got maybe one type of data store. If something happens to one of those running processes, someone hacks into something, they've got access to everything, right? Literally all my eggs are in one basket, or a very small number of baskets with exactly the same eggs in it if I'm load balancing. And that's sort of an interesting problem because your ability to do defense in depth, to actually provide multiple types of protection is somewhat limited. Of course, with a microservice system, if someone hacks one part of your system, the impact is therefore somewhat limited. You can also do some interesting things. You can probably, how many people here are using something like Amazon or some of those sorts of systems, or Docker? Those platforms, for example, provide you what's called software-defined networking layers, so the ability to write code, configuration, to define things like custom subnets. You can do things like putting different types of services on different subnets, setting up peering relationships between them, giving you effectively multiple network perimeters of which you can provide protections. That is a great boon, a great benefit. By opening up multiple seams, we allow ourselves to defend at multiple points all the way down the stack. That's great. So what you're telling me, Sam, is that our microservices systems will be more secure than our monolithic previously past systems. Well, not so much, because microservices giveth and they taketh away. Because also what happens, of course, when we move from a monolithic process is all of those things that used to be in-process calls are now network calls. So now what used to be sort of fairly protected traffic is stuff that might be flowing over your corporate networks. Hands up how many people here do anything basic like just run HTTPS on internal networks. How many people here run HTTPS? Yeah, that's I'm pretty sure half of you are lying, but that's still pretty low, right? You know? We don't tend to think too much about what happens inside our perimeter. And when we move to microservice architectures like this, we are opening ourselves up to more places where traffic can be intercepted, payloads can be manipulated, endpoints can be addressed. And we also have more machines, more processes that can be looked at, attacked. So we've also potentially increased the surface area of attack as well. So we have the opportunity to make our systems more secure and to defend them from malicious external parties, and internal parties even. But actually, I think out of the box, our systems can sometimes be less secure unless we apply a bit more thought. I used to work at ThoughtWorks for many years, and internally we had a model that we used to talk about application security. I think often we really focus on prevention. Let's stop the bad thing from happening. And I think if we focus entirely on prevention, although it's probably the deepest subject from a technical point of view, you're going to miss a trick. So I used to be a consultant. I therefore have a quadrant. So we start off with prevention. So we need to think about how we stop bad things from happening. We then talk about detection. If somebody has attacked a system, hacked our system, gained access, will we even know? Once we know about it, do we know how we're going to respond to that attack? The nice thing about application security is there's so many great examples of organizations that respond incredibly badly to these sorts of attacks. So we've got lots of fun stories to share there. And once you've responded to, say, a breach, to an attack on your system, how would you then recover from that case? And we're going to take a look at each of these in the context of microservices. But we'll start with prevention. It was probably about 5 years ago now, I think, when I was working with a company who were starting to get a bit more serious about application security, and so they created an in-house InfoSec team. And so that InfoSec team was starting to look across the entire organization, everything from sort of laptop security, data center security, down to premise security and the like. And we're looking for vulnerabilities, and we're starting to put out a few pilots to make improvements. And one of the first things they sort of raised was this idea of actually putting CCTV cameras on the front door of our offices. And what they said was this actually acts as a twofold thing. On the one hand, having a CCTV camera up prevents people coming in because it's a deterrent. You know, premise security from a technology point of view actually can be quite serious. If you can just walk into an office and jack into your corporate network, have a camera up, and you might deter people from coming in. But you'll also have a sense of what happened if something does happen. You can at least see, well, did someone come into our offices that we didn't normally expect to be there? Could they be the person? You could then pass that information on to the authorities and the like. Now, this ignited a firestorm of internal hand-wringing and debate and angst and anguish. Oh, you're invading my privacy. When somebody think of the children, you don't trust me. My rights are being violated. Developers, too much time on their hands, not dealing with serious issues, hysteria. And this went on for a while, and then probably a few weeks, and it wasn't always a great conversation. And then somebody said, maybe before we put the CCTV camera on the front of our office and then our reception, maybe we should make sure the door works. Because the lock for the front door of the office I was based in hadn't properly worked in a good couple of years. So frequently it would just, you'd think it's locked, it would blow open, wouldn't always close properly. You'd walk in the morning and the door's wide open and the alarm hasn't gone off, and that's a bit odd. So maybe spending, $100 on getting a locksmith in to fix the front door might be a better way to spend our time and energy than, putting up a several $1,000 CCTV camera. And this is the issue when it comes to prevention in the field of application security. We often get fixated on the wrong things, and we're not always able to step back and look rationally at where should we spend our time, where should we spend our energy. And we fixate on the things we see, and we don't think about other things. And inevitably, of course, it's something we didn't think about. We don't always think, am I fixing a camera, or am I fixing the door? So when it comes to prevention, one of the first things you're going to want to do, if you want to think sort of rationally and holistically about sort of application security, is actually to step back and do some form of threat modeling. Now, there's a whole bunch of really good threat modeling processes out there. Some of them are quite lightweight. You can do them yourselves. I'm going to talk a bit about sort of a very, very small part of that. I would thoroughly recommend going and looking at Microsoft's threat modeling process, Stride and Dread and all those sorts of things. But just to give you a taste of what threat modeling can do for you, I'm going to share some examples from Bruce Schneier. He's a technique he called attack trees. And this approach comes up time and again in different threat modeling processes. It was on Dr. Dobbs. Dr. Dobbs is now dead, so it's now on his site. But anyway, it's there. And so the way he breaks the problem down is, it's okay, well, look, what you've got is you've got a malicious party, and you've got vulnerable stuff, and you've got things that you don't want them to achieve. And so you put the thing you don't want them to achieve at the top. So in this particular situation, the thing we really don't want that malicious person to achieve is to open our safe. And so then what you do is you start enumerating the different ways in which that could happen. And some of the threat modeling processes go into more detail to help you think rationally about that. But in this particular example, so I want to open the safe. Well, how could I do that? I could pick the lock, I could learn the combination, or I could cut the safe open. And you keep going. Okay, well, how could I learn the combination? Well, I could find the combination written down, or I could get the combination from the target. And it becomes a bit Jason Bourne, and it's all very exciting. Because I think this is the world of the InfoSec. They're all quite paranoid people, often quite rightly so, because they sit down and spend all their time enumerating potential risks, and then start thinking about how could they get the combination from our people, or they could blackmail them, they could threaten them, they could bribe them. And these are real potential risks. I mean, let's think rationally about it. Finding a combination being written down, I mean, who here has been in an organization that's had a password policy so complex that you saw co-workers write the password down on a Post-it note, right? A few of you? Who here has seen that awesome webcam where the organization said, we've got to use two-factor auth, so they all had their little RSA key, and they didn't want to buy RSA keys for everybody. It was a hassle for everyone to forget. They kept forgetting them, leaving at home. So they just put a public a webcam on it on the public internet, so everybody could share the same RSA token, right? This happens all the time. I worked in a bank, a fairly big bank actually, and your as a consultant, and your login name was actually a 9-digit number. Now, aside from how warm and fuzzy it makes you feel when you're identified by a 9-digit number, who remembers 9-digit numbers? I've got space in my head for about 4. And that one wasn't one of them. So now I've got to somehow know my sort of login name. And then the password policy involved, slaughtering chickens and things. So lots of people wrote both of them down on the same piece of paper. This happens all the time. And so then once you've enumerated your risks, you start looking at how hard it might be for an external party to use this sort of attack vector to gain access, in this example, to the safe. And you start applying weights. I mean, there's one example which is just level of difficulty. It might be cost to the attacker. In general, when we're looking at prevention, what you're actually trying to do is not necessarily make something impossible. What you're trying to do is raise the cost of something to such a degree that there's no incentive or benefit to the attacker using that avenue of attack. For example, if it costs our attacker $1 million to get a drill capable of cutting into our safe, but our safe is worth like $5,000 and we've only got $20,000 worth of bullion in it. Yes, they could do it. Yes, they could attack it. It's not actually financially viable for the attacker. We do these things all the time. And, when we start using long bit encryption, what we're saying is not that it's impossible for someone to crack a hash, just that it will take them either until the heat death of the universe or so much hardware that they can't possibly afford it. And so when you do this, you start looking at your weak spots. And you see, well, actually, it's quite easy to find the combination written down because I saw it this morning, and it's quite easy to bribe somebody because we pay people really badly. So maybe we should do things and put our energy in there to actually close off those attack vectors. So I could really recommend some process like this. The Microsoft threat modeling stuff is really well documented, and it's not that hard a process to at least do a first pass. And there are external people that will come in and spend a week with you and also do a fairly good job of this. Out of this, you'll start coming up with things like a prioritized list of where you should spend your time, where you should spend your energy. But we should talk now really about some specific examples of prevention that we could carry out in a microservice environment. So as many of you may know from previous talks in the book, I often use a fake domain of a company who is selling CDs online and is also streaming and selling physical CDs. And this is the site. So we've got the box, which is our perimeter. We've got sort of external UI clients in the form of a mobile application and a website. We've got a royalty payment gateway. We send them sort of information about what artists have been streamed. So we're sending them sort of payment, effectively information that is going to be used for us to pay royalties. So it's quite sensitive information. And inside our perimeter, we've got some services like a catalog to show you how much things cost. The music web shop is the main website backend. And some user data, right? So a very simple architecture. So when we start looking at problems, well, we should probably start talking about the first one I raised earlier, which is those in-process calls are now inter-process calls, are now exposed over our internal networks. So what can we do in the realm of looking at things like transport security? Where should we start? Well, as I mentioned earlier, let's talk about HTTPS, right? This should be very easy nowadays. But HTTPS itself is not a solution to all problems. So what does HTTPS, for example, give us? By the way, slight sidebar, some people have claimed that microservices are HTTP-based services. That's not the case, right? HTTP is just a very common technology used to allow services to talk to each other. I don't think you have to use it. I think it's a good default choice. It's a fairly widespread choice. But you can have services communicate in all sorts of ways, like message buses and RPC, and yes, even exchanging files. But let's talk about HTTPS. HTTPS is all the rage on the public-facing web, as it should be, because it should be a choice every single one of you make for your own websites. But what about internally, inside the network? What sort of benefits does it give us? Well, the first thing it gives us is server guarantees. I mean, I'm assuming you're using sensible certificates and not just making these things up. But look, it's giving us guarantees that the thing we think we're talking to is actually what we're talking to. Why is that important? Well, someone gets access to your network, they pop something up saying, hello, I'm the customer service. Just send me information. I promise I'm the real thing. Now with this, we've got some level of assurances that the thing I'm talking to is actually the thing I'm talking to. We also get guarantees to know that the payload itself hasn't been manipulated. That could be quite important. But we get no client guarantees. So a server receiving a request doesn't necessarily know who's made that request of it. Again, malicious party on your network starts just making API calls to extract all of your customer information. That's kind of not necessarily great. And so if there's nothing at the transport level confirming that these clients are who they say they are, that's problematic. And of course, the biggest downside historically to HTTPS has been this. Certificates and setting those things up is painful, right? It's just awkward. And, so much work. Got to phone a person and send an email. It's being difficult. Of course, we now have Let's Encrypt. I should really screen cap this. It's now open. Hands up who here has used Let's Encrypt or knows about Let's Encrypt. Okay, well, that's great. The rest of you should know. You can go look up now after this. Now, Let's Encrypt is very interesting. It came around last year. I first found out about it in, I think, March, April 2015. And it is a open, free, automated certificate signing authority. So you can go to them and get certificates, HTTPS certificates. People fixated when it first came out on the word free. It's free, I don't have to pay money anymore. As though the money was the blocker. How much does the root certificate from Thwaite cost you? $40 a year? You really telling me the blocker for you using HTTPS is $40 a year? In which case, how much do you care about your customers? That's not really the issue, right? The issue is this other word, it's automated. Because actually the process of getting new certificates and renewing them was typically a multi-stage manual process. When we're moving into the realm of microservices, we're often talking about dynamic provisioning of services, dynamic provisioning of the machines they run on. People are often using sort of cloud-based platforms. They're spinning up machines left, right, and center. And then to suddenly introduce a manual step in getting and installing and managing certificates or changing them became quite problematic. Now, of course, Amazon has solutions in this space as well, which are very good. This one has the benefit of being sort of universal. The backing Let's Encrypt is actually an open protocol called Acme, and it gives you like a nice command line. Like if I want to grab a certificate and automatically configure my Nginx server, I just type Let's Encrypt run, and it kind of just does that work for me. It just uses public key pairs to actually get the certs. This is really, really cool stuff. There are some downsides and support wildcard certificates, but actually, because it's so easy to issue these things in the first place, you don't really need wildcard certificates, so you can actually be more bespoke. So do look at that. So, okay, maybe we say, okay, well, HTTPS isn't fixing all of our problems, but maybe it's a good default choice. Now, I'm actually a good believer when it comes to microservices to having some default choices. So actually just saying, look, by default, this is what our services should do, this is how they should behave. Because there's some areas where you do want consistency. And when it comes to security, you may not want leaked links. So maybe we just say, look, within our perimeter, we're just going to adopt HTTPS everywhere. No, it's not going to stop all problems. Yes, it's fairly easy to do. The performance overhead of these things is pretty minimal nowadays, given modern hardware. We're no longer talking about 25% overhead on calls and things. So maybe just within our perimeter, we pick that. But we could maybe do better. What about something like client-side certificates? I really want to clash with thunder and like a bolt of lightning at this point, because it normally scares people, gives them the willies. With client-side certificates, we introduce the ability to have client-side guarantees. That's really nice. So now I know the person talking to me, there's some trust. I can say the request has actually come from them. Yes, that's good. I'm happy with that. But client-side certificates are even bigger pain in the bottom to use than sort of the server-side HTTPS type of certs. We're talking here about things like the phrase PKI, public key encryption infrastructure, will be used, and the automation in this space is pretty poor historically. There is stuff, again, Amazon have stuff in this space. There's Lima, which is a tool from sort of a pluggable PKI framework from Netflix. We should allow you to automate the process of issuing and renewing client-side certificates. They've built it on top of Amazon's own certificate stuff, but it's theoretically pluggable. I don't yet know of anybody else using Lima outside of Netflix. If you are in this room, please come talk to me, because I would love to spread the word about this stuff. But even if the client, you're not able to automate these, you may still decide it's worthwhile. Like maybe I start thinking, well, I'm looking outside here's perimeter. This is actually going over the public internet. I'm talking to some third party. We're worried enough about it that we are going to use some kind of client-side certificates. And maybe what we do is just, we accept that's a manual process. And quite often you'll do things like having some sort of edge service that terminates a client-side management of the certificates. So actually you're sort of isolating the points at which you have to do that handshaking. So that might be a decision you could make. That's not opt-out. The default is HTTPS everywhere. Maybe we start doing different things with our edge services. We should also talk about auth. And here I'm talking about both the auth, both authentication and authorization. Starting with the sort of the authentication part of this, which is, are you who you say you are? When we start thinking at the top of our stack, we start thinking of the traditional things we're all quite familiar with. We're thinking of OAuth, we're thinking of form auth. So logging into my browser, dropping some kind of OAuth token that is used to confirm that, yes, this person should have access to this system. And then authorization is typically an internal concern where I say, okay, yes, Sam is allowed and here's what he can see. And there are some things around authorization you can do with things like directory services, but increasingly your application itself, your services themselves, are going to have to sort of make decisions for themselves about what they allow you to do and what they don't allow you to do. You can't necessarily offload all that to third parties, nor should you, in fact. You have to deal with that internally. The issue, of course, is with a microservice-oriented system is that often when we carry out an action, we call a service which in turn might call another collaborating service in order to carry out that operation. So in this particular situation, maybe I'm pulling up my customer records, so I go to my history page, and to render the history page, the music web shop actually has to go off down to the user service to fetch my records back. Now this sort of interaction opens us up to a class of security problem that pre-exists microservices called the confused deputy problem. And the confused deputy problem is a class of problem where you can trick an intermediate party into asking for things they shouldn't be able to get. So I could be logged in as Sam, but I could formulate a request in this previous example to the music web shop saying, can I have Alice's data? Now, I am logged in. I am authenticated as Sam. Unless the music web shop is, rechecks that I'm authorized to get Alice's data, or there's a bug in how I handle that authorized code, I may then allow that call to go downstream. And what we often find is in these situations where we have these calls, where maybe you've even got guarantees that the server is the server and the client is the client, and so yes, these really are the real things talking to each other, but we then sort of embrace this idea of implicit trust. It's almost like a hive mentality in a way. We sort of work under the assumption that the user service says, oh, is that the music web shop asking me for something? It is? Okay, great. Well, whatever it wants, it can have. But we don't revalidate whether or not the initiating call from me is authorized to access that information. Now, there are ways of solving this problem. Some of them historically have been quite nasty. Are there any SAML fans in the room? There's a few, wow. We don't admit it. Now, theoretically, you can solve this problem using nested SAML assertions. And I knew this was a theoretical solution, and it seemed like it could work, but it looked too horrible to even contemplate. And so I assumed no one ever did it. I met a team in Norway last year who did it. They spent 6 months making it work, and they backed it all out. It was horrendous to make work. The way it basically works is you have multiple assertions. You sort of have assertions often for the services and then the caller inside, and you end up with these huge chains of things happening, especially when you have multiple stacks. Sort of a much simpler way of handling this is using things like tokens. You can issue a token when I'm logged in, when I'm authenticated, and I'd say maybe it's like a JWT token. And that token can be passed downstream. That token can be validated by services downstream and even interrogated for information about me. So it can get information out about my roles, for example, and decide whether or not to give me access to that information. I've found extremely few companies that have tried fixing this, by the way. I'm hoping that will change over time. Okay, so that was a brief run over looking at transport security. There's other things to look at, stuff like HMAC, different types of API keys which can help you. But let's think a bit about data at rest. This is the issue, of course, that someone hacks into my system, they get access to my data, all of my data is sitting there, and they might steal it and run away. That's not great. Typically, we'd start talking about encrypting databases. That's often painful with a monolithic system because the overhead can often be an impact. Often databases are a bottleneck in our system performance. So we start doing things like selectively encrypting individual tables. That gets complicated because sometimes you miss a table and you've leaked information. I've seen a couple of places where you're leaking information in the relationships between things that themselves aren't necessarily encrypted. So it becomes a bit of a pain. Now, of course, with microservices, what we're doing is we're also breaking up our data stores so we can actually selectively target our energy and efforts and just actually be simplistic in how we handle this stuff. We can just say, look, when we look at our system, if someone hacks in and gets access to the database for our catalog service, it's like, that's all public information anyway. Do I care? And the worst they could do is maybe go in and maybe change prices, but there were different ways of handling that other than encrypting the data. And so maybe I just say, actually, the data at rest I care about is the user service. The user service now is saying has to now run on an encrypted type of data store. Of course, then we have to have separate conversations about where keys are kept. But for that sort of stuff, you can go do some more research about what the databases support and look at stuff like Vault, which is awesome. A brief aside, this is, I hope, a fairly buzzword-compliant talk so far because I said the word microservices every 5 minutes at least. I need to amp up the buzzwordiness, so I should say Docker, 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 go, Docker, Docker. In the context of security and microservices, the reason I talk about this is because often they go hand in hand. No, you do not have to use Docker to do microservices. No, you do not have to do microservices if you use Docker, but the tool and the technique are quite complementary. Some things to be aware of. A lot of excitement around Docker initially was from developers who could suddenly sort of go and just run, look, I'm running Redis and Elasticsearch on my machine, on web scale on my laptop. And they'd run single commands, and what they're doing is they're pulling down containers, they're putting down images from the Docker Hub. Anyone here use the Docker Hub to pull down images and stuff? Yeah, okay. So things to be aware of for the Docker Hub. There is a certain level of trust around the Docker Hub. There are official images, official contributors. What that means is that Docker have taken steps to ensure that the person who uploaded that image is really who they say they are. They don't really necessarily do much beyond that in terms of verifying whether or not that image is safe and secure. They do some stuff. So this was about 18 months ago. Banyan Ops did some research. They found that 30% of all the official images in Docker Hub had critical vulnerabilities in it. Now, this wasn't people uploading malicious stuff necessarily. The issue is when you create a Docker image, it's immutable. And so you upload it, and it's based on, say, some Ubuntu image, and time passes, people find bugs, and they find critical vulnerabilities. Those things are patched, but your image is not patched. Docker have now exposed the security vulnerabilities. They do some vulnerability scanning now on the public Docker Hub. So you can go and look at any image you depend on and see the vulnerabilities. Interesting thing to note, of all of the Ubuntu images from the official Ubuntu user, the official Ubuntu images, how many of those do you think have critical vulnerabilities in them of the ones that have been scanned? Like 5%, 10%? How about 100%? Every single one of the Ubuntu official images on Docker Hub has vulnerabilities on them. Actually, the vulnerabilities they have are bash vulnerabilities that were patched in 2014, even in the 1604 kernel, the 1604 distro, which is kind of interesting, right? So when you grab these things, they are not necessarily in of themselves safe or risk-free, and you have to understand the transitive chain of trust effectively you have when you download these things. I will not install stuff in the public Docker Hub in production, because for me, personally, that feels like I've found a thumb drive in the gutter, I've plugged it into my production systems and go, yeah, she'll be right. Now, there are things that we can do. There are increasingly great tools to help us scan and look for vulnerabilities. The way Docker images are built up based on layers allows things like Clair, which comes, so C-L-A-I-R, which comes from CoreOS, to actually do those scans inside your build pipelines, right? So, you can actually build in scans on the images you yourself create. Normally with the Docker Hub, I'll actually copy I'd look at what they've done, I maybe copy that and I'll pull that into my own private repo. Some organizations that allow you to host private Docker repos will also do that scanning for you. So increasingly you're seeing that stuff being automated. So just please do be aware of it. Now there is actually an argument for running a lot of things in Docker, because Docker by itself can actually provide protection. But I don't think you could consider Docker a sensible way of isolated, untrusted code. And that's effectively what you're doing when you're putting a public image down from Docker Hub and running it in production. So just be aware of that. We should also, I also mentioned the Microsoft stuff, so the links will be in there. I'll send around links to all these slides afterwards, so you don't have to take photos now. One last thing, please patch all of your stuff. This is the making sure the door lock works or prevention. A large amount of data breaches are caused by bugs that have been around for months, if not years, that people do not patch. You need to be patching your production infrastructure at least once a week. If you're doing things like rolling custom AMIs and Docker images, fantastic. There's some reasons why that's great from a security point of view. But if you haven't actually updated those or rolled out new versions on a weekly basis, you've potentially got unpatched machines running there. There's systems out there like Upguard that you can run on your infrastructure to look for unpatched machines. So that can be worthwhile. Patch your stuff like weekly, and I'm really serious about that. Otherwise, you're going to get bit hard. Let's move on to detection. A lot of this is about stopping bad things from happening, but if it does, we need to know. Often the very first place to do is to just even know when people alert you that, oh, by the way, we found a huge vulnerability in Node.js version 2. I don't know what version's up to. I don't do Node, I'm afraid. So, subscribing to services like Qualies and things like that can be useful to see those CVEs as they roll in. And there's actually increasingly automated tools out there that will actually look at the critical vulnerabilities for your technology stack and will scan your software and say, oh, by the way, there are 3 new versions of libraries that you use that are out there that fix critical vulnerabilities. Those things are things that we're increasingly building to our CI pipeline. Now, those things, though, are often helpful in terms of determining if we've been affected. So, for example, when I was still at ThoughtWorks, I helped run our internal systems. Shellshock came up. So Shellshock was this really, really serious exploit path that was discovered within Bash and the bug had been around for at least sort of a couple of years, and was sort of made a large number of Linux servers vulnerable to external exploits. Now, the interesting thing when I was talking to the internal InfoSec team was they said, well, look, we've got everything patched, we got it all updated, and we worked really hard to get that done. But what we don't know is, did someone actually use this exploit against us in that time? And so we started talking about how we'd know, and he said the very first thing he would want to know is, where are our logs? Where are our application logs, our access logs for our machines? This is one of the best things you can do. Just from the point of view of microservices in general, aggregating your logs is a great way of helping you understand what the hell's going on in your system. From a security point of view, this is really useful. Using something internally like the Elk stack, getting a hosted service like Sumo Logic, get your logs off of your machines and get them somewhere else. A security professional can use those to sometimes look at, see, have we been affected by some sort of attack? Even the absence of information can be useful. Some of these rootkits will actually remove traces themselves from logs. If an attacker does gain access and wipes out the logs on the machine and you've already shipped them off, then you may be in a better place. If you are doing this, talk to your security professionals, because often they'll want a longer retention cycle than, say, development purposes will want. So I think from a security point of view, we were keeping like 5 years worth of our logs was the process we wanted to go on. There was also things out there like mod security, application firewalls. These things can often stop things that obviously look malicious. They can also do things, though, like that alert you to things that might be suspicious. And you can, of course, with microservices, because we have the ability to have multiple perimeters, you could apply multiple different services on those different perimeters. And that can often be useful because sometimes these things are expensive. And so maybe you actually apply these protections just around the most critical services. When it comes to knowing if something bad's happened, we do have to address one of the things that we talk about a lot in the context of microservices, and that is the ability to embrace a polyglot development style. So having multiple different programming languages. This is often cited as one of the big benefits of microservices. But if you're trying to keep up to date, make sure your stuff is patched, make sure you're running the latest versions, make sure you're using the right coding practices for your tech stack to ensure that you're creating secure services, having a really polyglot development environment can be a challenge, especially at the beginning. If you've got a high degree of automation, maybe that's okay, but this is really difficult. This is partly why, yes, you get the option to have a polyglot environment. When you're first moving towards microservices, this is one of the reasons why I advocate actually keeping things really simple and maybe sticking to one technology choice, at least for your main development stack, until you sort out sort of your automation and tracking around these things. The flip side to the polyglot world is that, yes, there are potentially more things to track, more things to keep up to speed with, but there's also more things to break. An exploit that gains access to your Ruby app is not necessarily going to work against your JVM-based service and vice versa. And so when you do have, say, an attacker trying to gain entry into your system, they're going to have to use potentially more tools at their disposal to gain access to what they need. Let's move on to response. Who here has heard of Target? Anyone here have heard of Target? A few of you have. So this is kind of interesting, because this is actually, Target is an example of an organization that did a fairly good job about detection and did a fairly awful job about response. So Target is one of the largest retailers in the US, and unlike most of the large retailers, or at least at the time, they actually have an internal information security team, and a pretty good one. Well-ish. So what happened was a malicious party installed malware onto the tills in Target stores. That malware just was like memory resident and just sat there. And as people came in and used their credit cards, it just siphoned the credit cards. And then at some later date, all of those credit cards were bunched up and exfiltrated out of Target. I learned the word exfiltrated from CSI Cyber, which is where I get all of my cybercrime information from. And then they were sold on the dark web. So all this information went out there, and that's not good. I saw some estimates that around 40% of all US credit card holders were impacted by this particular hack. Target is used by a lot of people. Now, there was a bunch of problems here. The first was, when they found out about this, they were very, very slow to let people know. Very slow to let people know. And that's not a good look. I think it was actually either someone in the Senate or the Congress that actually forced them to to go public with this. It's interesting to note that outside of certain regulatory type boundaries, there's very few places in the world where there's a legal requirement for people to notify of security breaches. Very few countries actually have legislation on their books where they have to tell you about this stuff. Like HIPAA in the US, you have to, but that doesn't cover Target. Now, this was bad, right? This was huge impact, but it got worse when people started digging into what actually happened. So it turned out that, as I said, Target did actually have an internal InfoSec team. That InfoSec team saw the malware being installed, and they said, malware, malware, Bueller, malware. And then they saw all that malware taking those credit cards out and went, no, credit card go bye-bye, hello. And they were ignored. They had the team, they had the tools, they had the technology. They didn't have the integration and internal communication pathways with which that information was taken seriously enough for anyone to do anything about it. It's sort of interesting, right? From a response point of view, you've got a team. How are they structured? How are they wired into your organization? Who do they report to? How do you get information flowing through your organization? Just as I was leaving ThoughtWorks, I've sort of been talking for a while actually about taking the InfoSec team inside that historically reported to the CIO and actually moving them to reporting directly to the CEO as a way of sort of improving the flow of information. This did very well for the company that picked this stuff up, which was FireEye. They then actually did themselves no favor with the application security community with a whole bunch of stuff that did it later on. I won't necessarily badmouth them because they're run by a load of people that are ex-CIA and they probably know where I live. If you want to know more about the Target breach or just information in general about sort of cybercrime and the things that happen, I can thoroughly recommend Brian Krebs. And so he covered this in detail. He goes out on the dark web to find out how much credit cards cost so you don't have to. Interestingly enough, some of you may remember the DNS attack recently that took out people like Spotify and those sorts of things. That botnet, their first target, which I think was a dry run, was actually his website. So people don't necessarily like what he does, but he writes very well and very approachably about this stuff. There is a comms angle to all of this response, right? It's sort of, how do you get out? When something awful does happen, there's a great degree of value in actually just coming out. I mean, part of the reason the Target situation was made worse is they didn't get out early enough. They didn't get in front of the story. Comms is really, really important in this world. And I'm going to share a couple of stories with you in a moment, but the first thing I would say to you is you probably want to have a bit of a chat internally about if the worst happens, who's going to send the email to your customers? Who's that going to come from? Is that going to come from your chief security officer, your CEO, your CTO? What's that email going to say? Maybe come up with a few disaster scenarios, draft different emails. Because let me tell you this, none of you are going to be thinking clearly when the shit hits the fan and you're running around like headless chickens. No one in that mode goes, let's draft a really well-considered email. It's not going to panic everybody. We can definitely find a little space. Do it now. It doesn't take long. Just draft it up. Because a good, well-written email that you get out there early really can help. To give you an example of a company who did this very badly, let's talk about Ashley Madsen. Any Ashley Madsen? I'm not going to ask you to do that. Now, obviously, this was an interesting story when it came out because of the slightly salacious nature of the site. But the interesting thing was sort of how the story grew around this, and it was partly about the actual nature of what this site is for, but it was also partly about the way they handled things. So what happened was a group gained access to a large quantity of the information behind Ashley Madsen, and they said, unless you shut this site down, we're going to share this information on the web. And Ashley Madsen said, you don't have our information. You don't have it. And they go, yes, we do. And they go, no, you don't. And they go, yes, we do. And then these independent security researchers verified yes, they did. And they said, okay, maybe you've got a very small amount. And they said, no, we've got all of it. And they said, oh, okay, you don't have all of it. We've got all of it. All right, you've got all of it. That's all you've got. And they go, well, actually, we've also got your source code. No, you don't. We have. Okay, you have. We've also got your emails. No, you don't. We have all your emails as well. And this is bad, right? But this sort of drip feed of denial and from Ashley Madsen themselves stretched out this story way more than it needed to be. And actually, if they'd just been sensible and hired a decent security researcher, they could have verified probably in 24 hours that the information they had was what they claimed to have. I know at least one person that actually did that at the time. So this was bad, right? And they stretched this story out. There was sort of Troy Hunt put me onto another case. There's a site called Adult Friend Finder, which is where you find an adult friend for adult activities. Now, that site was actually a little bit more, the data it stored was slightly more sensitive, because you would actually sort of declare what adult activities you would like to engage in with a certain special somebody or somebodies, depending on the nature of your desires. And all of that information was breached and was made available. And I can't remember, it was some of the senior executives that came out of that organization and said, don't worry, they haven't got your credit cards. Like, what happens if someone steals your credit card? You phone up the bank, you get your money back. It's normally resolved within a week, and normally 10 days, 5 to 10 days, you've got a new credit card. Doesn't seem like a problem to me. It's painful, it's awkward, it's irritating. If someone gets to learn about all of your sexual predilections, that information isn't going back in the bottle. The lack of empathy displayed by that person making that statement is staggering. It's often not just the speed and the response, it's actually about empathy and caring. You really need to have that, otherwise you're going to make missteps. A good counterexample would maybe be the Tylenol poisoning scare in the US. So it's many years ago, I think it was the 70s or 80s, where it was several people were killed by Tylenol, which was at the time the biggest sort of off-the-shelf pain medication available in America. And so it was in Chicago only. They never actually worked out who did it or how they achieved it. And I think it was 7 people died. Very, very quickly, Johnson & Johnson, the parent company, pulled Tylenol from the shelves all across the US. Not just in Chicago, but all across the US. They developed sort of anti-tampering mechanisms that are now industry standard to improve their supply chain security, and then they went back out. The recall at the time cost them $100 million, and with inflation, that would be significantly more now. The interesting thing was the public saw their response. The moment it went back on the shelves, it went back to being the number one pain medication. And their PR boost off the back of this was huge. They didn't do it for the PR boost, they did it because it was the right thing to do, and the public reacted. I think your public, your customers understand that sometimes something bad's going to happen. They're going to look to you to handle that problem, that situation well. It's not always interesting when you work with, you have a company you love, something goes wrong and they just screw it all up and your view of them changes. You actually might think better of them when they come out and are very clear about it. There was a similar situation recently in the US, in Australia where I live. So Telstra is the biggest telco. It's sort of their incumbent, sort of previously state-owned monopoly. There are other ways you can respond badly in ways that actually affect your company and your employees directly. So there was a huge outage, took out mobile telephony, fixed network telephony for a large proportion of Australia. Australia's quite a distributed country. There are an awful lot of people who live in the country that rely on mobile phones for connectivity. This was a big deal. Now, they did the right thing. They came out very quickly with we're really sorry, we're looking into it type email. The problem was what was actually said. The statement came from the COO, so good, you're coming from a fairly senior person in the organization. That shows that you care, and it's a senior person taking that was good. But what they said in the statement was a bit concerning. The employee responsible didn't follow procedures, and clearly that's not a good thing. But I wouldn't want to preempt the proper investigation, and we'll figure out what the right response is when we've had a chance to dig into the detail. This is very interesting because they don't know what happened, but they definitely know that someone's to blame, and they say so right at the beginning. The employee, singular, didn't follow procedures. This sends a whole load of interesting messages. Firstly, you haven't done your actual post-mortem. You've already decided to blame somebody. Secondly, how many people in Telstra do you reckon work out who that individual was very quickly? What sort of message does this send to you if you work for Telstra and this thing happens? So if anything goes wrong, that's another thing. What kind of telco has a system where one person can make a single mistake and it takes it offline for a country of 24 million people? Right? That's fascinating. The COO is no longer in their job. There were multiple continuing outages afterwards, because guess what? Turns out it wasn't just that one person's fault. There were actually issues with the system. There's a great keynote by Sidney Dekker. He used to be an airline pilot, and then he worked looking at air traffic disasters. He specializes in looking at failure in systems. He argues, I think very convincingly, that as human beings, we're almost hardwired to look for a person to blame when something goes wrong. And that's really, he says, that actually we create systems in which people, a person making a mistake can cause a failure. We can't look at an individual as being the source of failure. We need to look at the system that person operates in. John Allsport puts it a bit of a different way. He says, finding the root cause of a failure is like finding a root cause of success. We're quite good when something good happens. We talk about the efforts of everybody, how everybody contributed, how it was fantastic. When something goes wrong, who's the last guy that left the company? They're always the best person to blame, aren't they? Because they've gone and they can't defend themselves. There was a silver lining. Tacher didn't have a free day today, the first of many. Happened to be on a Sunday, so businesses can take advantage of it. But one lucky soul managed to download almost a terabyte of data over on his little mobile 3G dongle, so he was quite happy. Let's finish up now by talking about risk recovery. There's not too much to say here, to be honest with you. Let's start with backups. You've all got them, right? They're all tested, right? Backups are important because it's not just people nicking your data, it's people doing things like encrypting your data. How many people, I mean, there's probably a couple of you here that have either been the victims of or have family members that have been victims of things like laptop crypto lockers, where they encrypt all of your information, say, if you don't give me 1 Bitcoin or 0.1 Bitcoin, I will delete your laptop. Of course, you've got backups, you don't care. You want a laptop, reinstall your backup. Don't pay Bitcoin. Don't pass go, don't pay £200. But how many of you actually automate your backups? How many of you test those backups? Right now with a monolithic system, you've probably got one. Maybe you do it, maybe you test it. It might not be automated, but you maybe know it works. You start moving to a microservice-oriented system. Those are more backups you've got to store for your separate data sets. Automation is the key. The other thing where you can recover, burn the thing down. You get rootkitted and someone's in there and they've patched PS and they've patched RPMs and there's funky things when you try and update it. You can't live with that machine anymore. You have to wipe that machine out. Now, if you're practicing using things like configuration management systems like Puppet, Chef, Ansible, where you're version controlling how you build your machines, you can build them automatically. Maybe you're using Docker images, where the recipe effectively for creating those Docker files are checked in. Destroying your machines and recreating it is easy. You just burn it all down. Again, this stuff all becomes much harder with microservices if these processes, rebuilding a machine, reconstituting backups, if those processes are manual, this is going to be difficult for you. I also say, if you've done postmortems, review them from time to time, maybe every quarter as a team. Take a look at what you discussed last time. Look at the action plans. Did we actually do those things? Did that work? So just to summarize, when we're thinking about application security, we need to think a bit more broadly. We can't just think about prevention. Prevention, yes, is important, but you're not always going to get that right. So we need to be thinking about how we know if we failed in preventing something. Did it occur? How do we know? Know how to respond. Have those conversations early with your team. Talk about the comms plan. Talk about the emails you're going to write. Who's that going to come from? Who's going to be the contact point? Do that while things are calm. Not while people are running around like a bunch of Americans. Anyway. Recovery. With recovery, automation is key. I don't think you need to have everything fully automated around build and deployment necessarily to start using microservices. Maybe if you've only got 2 or 3 of them, that's probably okay. You've got 5, 10, 15, 20, you need automation. You may need some standardization to make that work. I mentioned about the book. You don't have to buy it in all seriousness, but it's out there. And I've also got my blog where I sort of write about architecture patterns around all this stuff, and there's also a blog post I do where I interview interesting techie people. Now, without that, I think I've got some time for questions. Not a lot of time for questions. Maybe I could time for one question. One question there.
You mentioned Docker, and it's not safe to pull those public images.
Yep.
So what I do is schedule unattended upgrades. Is that something you see also in the shop?
So you said, so instead of using the public Docker Hub, you sort of do unattended upgrades? So, I mean, the key thing for me is the source of truth. Where's that information coming from? So, I mean, I don't necessarily think an unintended upgrade is going to necessarily fix that problem if you're still using the Docker Hub as a source of truth. And there are some ways you can work around some of the issues with the Docker Hub, things not being patched. You can extend from public Docker Hub images, and you can automatically, and then you can straight away, run your Apt-Get upgrade and those sorts of things to run those patches when those images get downloaded. But yeah, I might be missing something, but maybe we can talk more afterwards. I'm going to go let you get lunch. I'm going to be around today and tomorrow. I'm on Twitter at Sam Newman. If you want to ask me questions, do so there. But thank you for your time.